the greatest fiction of all might be that there is a true story.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, your book club discussion times 10. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like you to join me as I take a deep dive into the world of literature. In this episode, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author William Irwin. William is Herve A. LeBlanc Distinguished Service Professor and Chair of Philosophy at King's College, and is the author of Free Market Existentialist, Capitalism Without Consumerism. He is also the author of Intentionalist Interpretation, a philosophical explanation and defense. Irwin originated the philosophy and popular culture genre of books with Seinfeld and Philosophy, The Simpsons and Philosophy, and The Matrix and Philosophy. Free Dakota is his first novel. I hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Read, Learn, Live. I am here with William Irwin, or Bill. We're going to talk about his book, Free Dakota. Bill, say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Great. We're real happy to have him. It's a real interesting, fascinating book combining philosophy and storytelling in a really interesting way. So I'm really excited to have a chance to speak with him. So I think we're just going to jump right into it. You ready, Bill?
Sounds good, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on. So I always like to start out and learn a little bit about the writing process because I love writing and I'm really curious to know what works for people. And I know you happen to be a pretty prolific writer, right? You've got lots of other books out there.
Well, I've written lots of philosophy, so nonfiction, but this is my first work of fiction.
Yeah, so you've written all these nonfiction books. Why did you decide to turn to fiction?
Well, honestly, I've always wanted to write a novel. When you tell somebody you've written a book, oftentimes they ask you, well, what's the story? And then I'm left backtracking, suggesting, oh, well, it's not a story book. It's not a novel. It's not fiction. It's this or that. And I see their interest wane pretty quickly sometimes. Not just to satisfy people like that, but to satisfy myself. I've always wanted to write a novel, and I'm really happy that I finally have.
That's great. So, of all the potential types of novels, was there any reason you decided to write this book in particular, this story in particular?
Well, the story of Free Dakota is about a secession movement, modern day in North Dakota. And I guess the reason that I decided to write this book is it was inspired by a couple of real-world scenarios. One is a secession movement in Vermont called the Second Vermont Republic, something that most people haven't heard about, but there is actually an active secession movement in Vermont. And next door in New Hampshire, they have a movement called the Free State Project, where they're encouraging people to move to New Hampshire to change the local laws. And it just struck me that those two ideas could work together so that people could be encouraged to move to a particular state to have that state secede from the Union. So it was just musing on the combination of those two possibilities that got me thinking, what would it be like? And so that takes us into the realm of fiction.
Great. And so, could you briefly did it, but maybe just sort of give a more expanded summary of the story of the book for everybody.
Sure. So there is a writer in New York City named Don Jenkins, and he, through a series of events, finds himself involved in the secession movement in Vermont, and he's kind of what I call an accidental libertarian. He really had never thought very much about politics. But the more he thinks about it, the less he likes any kind of government involvement. And the secession movement in Vermont doesn't work out, and he is sort of lured to North Dakota by this diner owner, John Mackey, who is promising this sort of libertarian paradise on the prairie. And so then most of the action takes place in North Dakota with the attempt of this movement to secede.
Okay, and so, this was your first time writing a fiction book. I'm just curious about your writing process and whether that process was different than your prior books.
Yeah, very different, because most of the work that I've done previously has been rather academic and research-based. And so it requires just very careful footnoting and checking. And so there was, for me, something very liberating about writing fiction, because what's true in the fictional world is largely up to me as the author within certain constraints. So that was really liberating. I mean, it was easier in a way and then harder in other ways.
Right. Sometimes when you have a totally blank canvas, it can be a little bit harder to work with than when you're a bit constrained.
That's right.
Okay. Was there anything that was particularly difficult?
Well, the hardest part for me was revising. Through the years, I've learned how to revise when writing philosophy and when writing nonfiction. It's largely about getting the arguments right. But fiction really isn't about arguments. It's about creating a world. And so when you change something in the editing process, it has just all kinds of ramifications throughout the whole world that you've created. And that's pretty maddening. And for me, it was very hard to learn how to do that. I don't know that I've fully succeeded, but it's a learning process, and it's pretty taxing, the revision process.
Yeah, I can imagine. Did you have to work a lot with your editor and try and satisfy kind of their demands, or were you given a lot of space to work?
The book wasn't contracted until it was in pretty good shape. So I was through a lot of revision, working with friends and my wife and other readers. So originally the book was about twice as long as it is now. As it turns out, it's a rather short novel of just under 200 pages, or just over 200 pages. But it was twice as long as that. A lot of it just had to go. It was fat. It wasn't lean. And cutting parts just had major implications for parts that stayed. And so that was really the tough wrestle for me.
Sure, and that makes me think about that, forget who it was, but the famous sculptor that said that, they don't really create anything, they just take away the parts of the rock that aren't necessary.
Right. I forget, is that Michelangelo maybe?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I certainly wouldn't compare myself to Michelangelo, but there's really something to that, that you've got this lump that you have to kind of shape somehow.
So maybe tell me about a time that something you wrote surprised you, right? Where even, you're typing and you're thinking about it and you're like, oh, well, wait, I didn't, where did this come from?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I was surprised every day, because I didn't start out with an outline for the story. I started off with the concept, as I explained, about this secession movement. And so every morning I sat down. I would write from 6:30 until 7:30, and every morning I was kind of surprised at what would happen. I would read back through what I had written the day before, just quickly to reorient myself, and then I would go. But to give a more specific answer, one thing that comes to mind is I hadn't had it in mind that one of the characters, Linda, was a lesbian until she met one of the other characters, Lorna, and had a kind of erotic reaction to her. So that was kind of funny to say, oh, well, she's a lesbian. I didn't realize that before.
And now that you're a novelist, do you feel like that there's anything specifically about the novel writing process that everybody thinks they know about, but maybe they're completely wrong, since it really seems to me a lot of people want to write a novel. Like you said, people are always, beforehand, we're always asking you about the story. So that's really something that people idealize, is the idea of a novel. But, what do you think they get wrong about it?
Well, it's hard to say what everybody gets wrong because there are just so many opinions.
Sure.
But I can tell you, for me, that one of the things that I had in mind that kept me from doing this, maybe in prior years, is that you really had to sit there and agonize about every word to get it right. There's the kind of stereotype of the creative writer where you're kind of holding your head and deciding whether to put a comma in for 3 hours in the morning and then spend 3 hours in the afternoon taking the comma out. I just didn't treat it that way. From what I read about writing, I read this book about writing a novel in a month. There's, I think, November that they often do this, or is it October? I don't know. National Write a Novel in a Month.
Yeah, it's November, right? It's
is
like
it November?
NaNoWriMo is the short word for it. Yeah.
That's it. So I didn't write this in a month, but I learned some valuable lessons for that about just writing. And I mean, I had developed some facility with words and writing from prior experience, but basically what I did is I gave myself an hour each day from 6:30 to 7:30 in the morning, and I sat down and wrote for that hour. And I had myself to a word count of 1,000 words in that hour. Now, I could have taken 3 or 4 hours to write 1,000 words, but I'm not convinced that they would have been any better words. And I don't know that would work for everyone, but it worked for me to just produce it, just get it out there. The words were sort of cheap that way. I was kind of thinking about it as almost like a photographer. I'm not a photographer myself, but you see photographers shoot rolls and rolls of film just to get one picture, right? And so this is why I didn't feel too badly about cutting the thing in half ultimately. The words came pretty quickly, and so I couldn't feel all that attached to them, right? And in general, I don't really, I've been fortunate not to be afflicted with writer's block, and I have some fun with that because the main character in the novel, Don Jenkins, the writer, has writer's block throughout the novel. He can't he can't produce another novel, and he starts blogging. But that just was never an issue for me. Now, maybe if I did greater quality control, I would find that I have writer's block. But I think it's that overly vigilant quality control that writers exercise upon themselves that gets them backed up in that way.
Yeah, that's a great point. And actually, what I was thinking about was how technology allows us that freedom, because photographers can now take so many photos because they're all digital. You can write all these letters and words because it's digital beforehand. If you're using film, if you're on a typewriter, it's a lot more expensive and time consuming to do all that.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And that's something that was occurring to me as I was doing this, just how fortunate I am to be alive in this day and age and being able to do it this way. It really took much more dedication, and I can see why. If paper and ink and typewriter ribbons and everything else are scarce and expensive, you really do have to agonize more over whether to put that word down on paper. But typing it into my computer, why not? Just put it down. It can always be changed, erased, thrown away, whatever.
That's right. What a world.
Yeah.
So I want to get into to the book itself now, because there's lots to talk about. So I think I want to kind of get into the style of the book up front, and
Sure.
The book is written in a very interesting style. And so it's a novel. There's a story. You tell a story, but it also interspersed through that are these conversations, these philosophical musings between characters. And you mentioned the character of Mackie, who has this cafe, and he's sort of the person where everyone goes to talk to about what's on their mind, and he acts as a centerpiece to that incidence of these philosophical musings. So I'm just really curious as to why you kind of decided to write that kind of a hybrid book.
Yeah, well, I mean, in some way it was drawing on what was more familiar to me, which is philosophy. And in philosophy, I've always admired and appreciated Plato's dialogues, which are sort of, as the description implies, kind of philosophical plays. You have characters exchanging ideas through speeches, and to me, this is how philosophy works best, through the exchange of ideas in conversation. And so, in order to put across ideas, I wanted to have characters exchanging ideas, I suppose. So that's sort of the inspiration there.
So, I had a question here about Free Dakota and the title in reference to the potential new state following that successful secession vote the movement hopes to achieve. And I wanted to ask if you thought something like that could happen. But as you said, it sounds like it's already out there in I think it was Vermont. And I know now that at least there's been, musings about it elsewhere. People in California are thinking, they want to succeed. And there's just people that are maybe expressing frustrations. And so I'm just curious, the extent to which you think these things could happen. What is, I don't know how much you've looked into the political chances here, but I mean, is this something that could happen at all, or is it a pie in the sky? And if it is a pie in the sky, is it still useful for people to have that kind of hope?
Right. So I think as you conclude the question, it's a hope, it's a possibility, it's a discussion, it's an option that shouldn't be taken off the table. So I had mentioned there's the Second Vermont Republic, and next door in New Hampshire they have the Free State Project. And I hadn't even been aware of this until last spring, I guess. But within New Hampshire, there actually is a secession movement as well, called the Foundation for New Hampshire Independence, I think. And a lot of secession movements prefer to use the term independence. That secession is a dirty word, right? It's tainted with the legacy of slavery, unfortunately, but it doesn't need in any way to be tied to that. So you'll see the language in terms of independence. You'll see there's a big Texas independence movement, and California, and after Brexit in the UK, we saw that sort of exit language being attached to secession movements. Cal exit for California secession, Texit for Texas secession. And actually back in June, just after Hillary Clinton had secured the Democratic nomination, I published an article online called "How Bernie Sanders Can Still Become President." You could just Google that, anyone, if they want to find it. And there I argue that if Trump becomes president, instead of going to instead of going to Canada, the way so many people have said they would, they should just go to Vermont. Everybody should move to Vermont who wants a different kind of government, and secede, and Bernie can be their president after all. So although the characters in the novel are concerned with primarily about a libertarian secession movement, it seems to me that this model could work in any number of possible ways, for any number of possible political stances. The conceit in the novel is that they go to a state that has a very small population. The population of North Dakota is only 700,000 people on something like 70,000 square miles. So you could conceivably, with a mass immigration, outnumber the native citizens of the state. And in a case like North Dakota, well, it's a beautiful state in many ways, but it's not California. So California or Texas trying to leave the Union, much more difficult sell than say North Dakota. So it's out there as a possibility. I don't think it's a likelihood anytime soon, but it's out there as a possibility.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting how people have turned towards that in a lot of ways, and maybe in a way of just expressing themselves, expressing their frustrations, and kind of imagining and dreaming. And I think that's why fiction is so important sometimes, is to help people think about what could be.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, so as you pointed out, there's a lot of philosophical musing in the book. The main character writes a blog, and so some of the philosophical musing takes place as excerpts from his blog. But you can write a scholarly treatise or an academic book or a work of political philosophy, and it reaches only so many people. But a good story, and I hope I have a decent story, speaks to many more people and gets people to think about things in a way that dry academic writing just can't. I mean, I think of Orwell, 1984, Animal Farm. Those kind of books really reach people with a story in a way that a dry academic treatise about the same issues just wouldn't do.
Right. And yeah, I want to talk about Don's blog. So Don is the main character. He has the Soda blog. Mm-hmm. And it is introduced as already kind of being a popular blog. He gets comments, people follow it. It's interesting. I see some similarities between that and even your book in that it's popular. It's written. It's using the written word to get important philosophical ideas across. I'm just curious about your thoughts in terms of how powerful the written word itself is. So there's obviously lots of ways to tell stories, but you're using a fictional novel here. Don is writing a blog, and both of those are happening in a world where people are doing Facebook Live and streaming video and stuff like that. So right. I'm just curious about what you think in terms of how well the written word is holding up.
Right. So just to clarify for the listeners, that it's called the Soda blog because his first entry results from him encountering a ban on 64-ounce sodas in convenience stores in New York City and sort of flipping out. And this is what leads him on this path to wondering why the government is intervening in his life, starting with this really sort of trivial way of telling him how big his soda can be. But he's a novelist who is facing writer's block with his fiction, and so he finds an outlet that he can write. He can just write his ideas, and his fiction were courtroom dramas. He's a lawyer by training, and had found his way into writing courtroom dramas, but he had become sort of sick of himself as a writer of courtroom dramas. It felt like he was just duplicating the latest Law and Order sort of scenario, writing a formula. And so he becomes entranced with ideas. And to get back to the thread of your question, John, the written word, I think, is incredibly powerful in that way, both for good and for ill. We hear so much talk these days about fake news and the way in which false ideas are spread via the internet, and that is unfortunately true. But it's also powerful in more positive ways, and just the existence of things like Wikipedia, and just having the world of knowledge at your disposal in a way that just was never possible before. I think of growing up and having a set of encyclopedias that were pretty terribly out of date, and I suppose I was fortunate for that. And now everyone has the written word, both in terms of information and opinion, at their immediate disposal 24/7. So I think there continues to be great power there.
Makes a lot of sense. And that's great to hear, right? I, as a fan of reading and writing, am always hopeful that the written word will retain its strength. So Don describes a seatbelt ticket, and he describes getting the ticket as a way of breaking a habit he knew was bad, but was socially conditioned to do. Right. So,
Right.
Do you feel like there's anything else like this we deal with?
Sure. So he wasn't very happy with it, but he sort of grudgingly admits after having gotten the seatbelt ticket that it would help him to break that kind of silly habit of not wearing the seatbelt. There are all kinds of what they call nudges, right? It's kind of small pushes, small incentives. I think in particular, another bad habit, of course, would be smoking, and the way in which laws have been enacted against smoking in most indoor facilities, even near the entranceways to doors. I know it was instrumental in having my father quit smoking many years ago. He worked, I don't even know on what floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan, and anytime he wanted a cigarette, he had to ride the elevator down, stand outside in the cold, smoke a cigarette, take the elevator back up. And although he didn't appreciate that, it was really the straw that broke the camel's back that got him to quit smoking. So something good comes out of it, I suppose, in that way.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I've definitely read a lot about that, where just sometimes making things a little bit more difficult or adding a little bit of a penalty, it doesn't seem like it would make a change, but sometimes it's just that little bit that really pushes us for whatever reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
The book mentions, there are laws that one would establish if you could build a society from the ground up. And so I want to ask you the ultimate open-ended question here, which is, if that was happening, what are some of the laws you would start with?
Well, yeah. So the characters in the novel have lots of discussion about the current state of things and what laws are problematic. And they do imagine what things will be like post-secession if they succeed. And I am sympathetic with the libertarian standpoint myself. And so instead of imagining what laws I would want to see enacted, I mostly am concerned with what laws I would want to get rid of. And that would be most of them, so that the role of government would boil down to protecting us from force, fraud, and theft, that we basically have to abide by the idea that we don't hurt other people and we don't take their stuff. Obviously, it would get more complicated than that, but I'm a real minimalist, I suppose, when it comes to what laws I think are necessary.
Lorna was intrigued by Don, and Don really was asking these questions, these deep questions, and he was asking questions that took Lorna places she didn't even realize she wanted to go. And I really thought that was a powerful statement. So I wanted to talk with you about the power of the right questions and what you think that role plays.
Yeah.
In the book or otherwise.
Yeah, good. So Lorna is Don's love interest, who eventually also comes to North Dakota. She has a colorful background that I'll just leave for the potential reader to discover for themselves, I suppose. And she becomes very instrumental in the movement. But as you say, Don asks her questions that really take her places that she didn't know she wanted to go. And again, this for me is the influence of philosophy. It's sort of the role that I see myself playing in the classroom as a teacher. I don't teach students what to think, but hopefully I teach them how to think. And I also introduce them to some subjects to think about and questions to ask that they weren't already familiar with or weren't already on their mind. So it's a terrific thing if somebody can leave you with a question that takes you in another direction with your life, or at least in your mental life, that this becomes important to you. And so that's part of the role that Don plays as, tutor or mentor to Lorna, in that way. And to me, it's an important role to play, not just with my students, but with my friends, my colleagues, and it's reciprocal, that they push me in that way as well, that they ask me questions that perhaps I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think it's really useful to get pushed like that, to get a little bit out of your comfort zone from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
So the flip side of that is, later you talk in the book about listening and how people often want to reveal themselves to you, but we're not always the best listeners.
Yeah.
How do you think people can do a better job of this?
Yeah. So in the book, John Mackey, who's the diner owner, who has really started this whole secession movement, and his diner becomes sort of the mecca for the movement, where people come and they converse and they hash out their ideas. It's his great gift that he listens, and this is really what had catalyzed him in this direction. Anyway, he hadn't originally been all that interested in politics, and his gift is that he can sort of listen between the lines, right? We talk about reading between the lines, but he listens between the lines, and in particular, he's good at paying attention to seemingly irrelevant or throwaway comments. And this is something that I've found. Of course, it's hard to be a good listener, first of all, right? You need to not just be thinking about what you're going to say next, but actually be absorbed by what the other person is saying, and really giving them your attention. And you have to pay attention not just to the main thread of what they're saying, but the sort of marginalia of what they're saying. Because oftentimes people don't want to reveal themselves too directly, but they're willing to give you a kind of a clue or a kind of a hint. And if you're perceptive enough to pick up on it, then they're willing to go into more direct discussion with you and maybe reveal more of themselves to you.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and definitely Mackey is sort of the key to all this. And he really espouses this very libertarian point of view. He talks politics constantly with people, but when he holds court at the diner, he very explicitly shies away from religion. He says no religion. So why is that, and why do you think it's important to keep those two separate in this case?
Well, that's just something about the character. I mean, obviously, we know people who bring their religion and their politics close together all the time. So it's just a dimension of the character where Mackey himself is very religious. He had been on the road to becoming a Catholic priest at one point, but left that pursuit, but remains religious. But I suppose he would rather live a sermon than preach a sermon religiously. And when it comes to politics, he's just become interested in it from having heard it discussed so many times over the counter at his diner. And for him, the two are kept separate. We might imagine that somewhere else, in another context, he'd be glad to talk about religion, but not about politics. So it's a feature of the character, although we know plenty of characters in real life who bring the two together without any hesitation.
So I want to think a little bit about the nature of jobs and work, and you touch on this a bit in the book. There's a character of Ben who worked real hard in school to become a doctor, so he can afford nice cars, get the hot girls. But in the end, he really lamented that it was just a job with long hours, was a bit dull at times. Why do you think that there's often that disconnect between our perception of a job versus the job itself?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of prestige and money associated with certain jobs that turn out not to be always all that rewarding, particularly if the reason that they were pursued is because of the money and prestige. And medicine is certainly one of those. And it's again, something that comes out of my experience of dealing with college students on an ongoing basis, where they're put on a path to pursuing a certain career, not because they have any kind of great devotion to it, whether it be medicine or law or what have you, but because they know you can make a lot of money in that position, and because people will be impressed by it, and that's a real prescription for an unhappy life, I think, and it's an unfortunate way to go about things. And so, in the book, the Dr. Ben ends up becoming more interested in politics, and in particular about this secession movement. And also the main character, Don Jenkins, had been a lawyer for until he was in his 40s, but really wanted to write, and so had begun writing when he could on the side, and was fortunate enough to turn that into a job that he enjoyed more, until he stopped enjoying it more, and as we meet him in the book, ends up with a pretty bad case of writer's block.
Right, and so you also raised a great point, which is the idea of a transition, and that sometimes, and you talk about this in the book too, is that sometimes people want out after something becomes mundane. It starts off amazing and fascinating, starts to become mundane. They don't want to push through. And also that the grass is always greener too. And so, we have this idea that our initial job starts to become dull, something else looks much better. But a lot of the time, people don't actually make that transition. Your characters were successful in making that transition, but a lot of people don't have that success. They're either not able to take that initial step or have trouble along the way. Why do you think that is generally?
Yeah, well, there are a variety of reasons, I suppose. Some of it is laziness. Some of it is inertia. Some of it is security. Some of it is really just quite responsible, I suppose, particularly if you're at a certain stage in life and you have a family and you have a secure way of making a living. It might be irresponsible to throw caution to the wind and try something else, which again is one of the reasons that I encourage students to, before they settle into a career, to try out different careers potentially, and have as many experiences as you can before you take on the responsibility of a family. So I suppose it's easy to point to people and blame them for not taking the leap and chasing the dream or whatever it may be, but the real reality is that for most people it's just the responsible thing to do once they've entered a certain phase of their life.
Yep. And at a much smaller scale, we'd already talked a little bit about how you had primarily or only written nonfiction beforehand. So did you feel any of that, difficulty in making that transition when you were trying to start up the novel?
Well, I have a very fortunate career situation in life, and that's largely of my own choosing. I suppose I had other career paths that were open to me where maybe I would have made more money, that kind of thing. But being a professor gives me a tremendous amount of autonomy. And I'm 20 years into my teaching career and tenured and sort of safe as far as you might say. And so I can take chances. I can, and really what did I do? I spent an hour a day for, I don't know, a couple of hundred days working on a novel. I'm fortunate to be able to do that, and I'm fortunate to be able to pursue other kinds of writing projects. I have a lot of autonomy there, whereas other people may not have quite as much in the life they have. But what was liberating for me to find, and it was sort of the message of that writing a novel in a month book and project, is that really almost anyone can make the time an hour a day and put that aside and do it. I mean, for me, it was a matter of getting up earlier and making sure that I just carved out that hour of time and did it. Somebody else who just can't stand mornings might do it late at night or whenever. But I guess the hopeful message I have for anybody listening who's an aspiring writer is that you don't need some kind of big research grant or cushy teaching position or whatever. If you can carve out an hour a day, and if you can do that just by staying up later or getting up earlier.
Yeah, and I appreciated that second part because I am the one that does not like mornings. So
yeah.
I will, in fact, never be up at 6:30 to write. But there's one last little thing. You talked about family very briefly. You talked about how it's not fair to look at your kids or grandkids through the lens of your own childhood because they're inevitably going to be different. But I think it's really interesting because I think we always make these comparisons between what's happening now versus how things were when we grow up versus how things might be in the future. I'm just curious about why you think we're making these constant comparisons and maybe a time that you made one that was unfair.
Yeah. So I think your question comes out of the experience of the main character, Don, who looks at his grandchildren and his daughter and has some disappointment that they're not more like him in a certain way. His kids don't like to play sports. They'd rather play video games. And that's pretty close to home for me. It's funny. The longer we live and the broader our experience, the more open-minded we are about different possibilities and different ways of living. But in my experience with my children, I can have a very narrow focus because, for example, my son just turned 13, and I have very vivid memory of what it's like to be 13 and what interested me and how I was and how I spent my time and what experiences I had. And I automatically seem to think that those things need to be the case for my son as well. In order for him to have a good or happy life, and it's just not true, right? So I'm constantly struggling with the idea that my son plays a lot of video games and doesn't seem to spend a lot of time in person with his friends, and those were the happiest times of my life when I was his age, spending time in person with my friends and playing ball out on the playground. And why doesn't he do that? And he's not going to have a happy childhood because of it, and it's just not true. And actually, that I'm glad you asked about that, because that sort of strain of thought led me to the next novel that I've written and that I'm currently shopping to a publisher, which deals with father-son relationships over generations and the way in which we expect something of a son, and a son expects something of a father, and really the key is to accept one another for who we are, just as we would accept people who are not family or not as close to us for who they are.
I think that's very powerful, and I'm excited to read your new book.
Oh, thank you.
Whenever that comes out.
Well, I will certainly let you know.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, and maybe connected to that a little bit is the idea that Don also theorizes that we tell stories, whether books, movies, elsewhere, for entertainment, because we tell stories about ourselves. And just like you were talking about how when you were young and your fondest memories were running around playing with your friends, and your son is playing video games now, we have these stories in our mind about ourselves, and we give our lives a narrative. There's a beginning, middle, end at some point. And we seem so tied to all of that. I'm just curious about why you think our minds are structured in such a way to really focus on that idea of a narrative.
Yeah, well, it's a question that I find fascinating, and I don't have any final answer to, except my sort of pet theory is that we tend to think about it backwards, which is we tend to think that, oh, I tell stories about myself because I'm so used to reading stories and watching stories, and I'm story saturated, and that's why I tell stories about myself in my own mind, whereas I think probably the truth is that we tell stories in the fictional realm of movies and television and books because we are by nature storytellers about ourselves, that we see ourselves not as living in isolated moments and disconnected, fragmented time, but playing out a narrative from beginning to middle to end. We look back on the past and we live in the present as a way of living towards the future. And why that is might find some answer in evolutionary biology. We're much more sophisticated in terms of our brain than our so-called lower animals who run basically on instinct, right? So the squirrel doesn't have the cognition of, oh, I better stow away some nuts for the winter, right? It is acting pretty well on instinct, but we're less instinctual or less gifted with instincts and more adaptable because we're able to anticipate and envision all kinds of possible futures and imagine what it might take to get to those futures. And so I think we sort of have to tell ourselves stories about where we are and where we've been as a way of getting us to where we want to be.
And, on top of that, at the very end of the novel, Don realized that no story was ever purely true. And, also that there could still be a truth in fiction, even a truth in lies.
Right.
And, it actually reminded me of this line. I used to watch The X-Files a lot when I was younger.
Right.
I love that show. And there was a line that said, all lies lead to the truth. And I always liked that.
Yeah.
So, in terms of all that, how do you think that plays out for us? And no story is ever purely true, and there are plenty of truths in fiction.
The greatest fiction of all might be that there is a true story, right? Just because we can get the facts right about what happened, but I don't know for any kind of complicated event, do we really ever know the whys, right? So you can think of a complicated historical event like World War I or World War II, and you can know all of the facts, but it seems to me impossible to know all of the whys, and no single person, no even actor in the drama knows that. And even the attempt to tell the truth about it is just always flawed. I think anybody who's ever had the experience of being involved in something that gets reported in the news, whether it's a big national news story or just a small local news story, knows that the story told through the news is never quite right, despite honest efforts to tell it correctly. It's very difficult to get the facts right. And even if you get the facts right, to deal with motivations and intentions, we just really don't have a complete picture, right? So in a way that liberates us then to look back on fiction, right, which is not even attempting to tell a true story. And it, though, can embody a sort of truth, right? Not a literal truth about the facts. These things never really happened, of course. But thematically, or in terms of feelings, emotions, the human experience, fiction can speak a kind of truth in that way. And so that's sort of a truth through lies. And I wasn't familiar with that X-Files line, but I love that all lies eventually lead to the truth.
Yeah, and that's a great response, and I think that's a perfect place to sort of wrap up our main discussion there, because that's
great.
That was my favorite thing thus far we've talked about, because I think that's so true.
Oh, great.
So I want to move on to our thunder round. So I hope you're excited. You ready?
I'm ready for the thunder round, John. Bring it on.
All right, great. We're going to ask you a couple quick questions, get a couple quick answers, and we're going to wrap it up.
All right. I listened to the podcast, so I think I know what some of the questions will be. I think so. Let's hear.
Okay, let's hear them. So first off, I want to hear about your favorite food and or your favorite drink.
I knew you were going to ask that. Okay. So favorite food would be either ribs from a place called The Rendezvous in Memphis, Tennessee, or buffalo chicken wings from Duff's in Buffalo itself. And drink, I drink unsweetened iced tea all day long.
All day, just like my dad. It's
Yeah.
you, boy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
he's very specific. No flavored, no anything else.
Right.
So, okay, number 2, where is your favorite place you've ever been?
Favorite place? Greece. In particular, Athens, Greece. And I was fortunate to get to some of the islands as well. Agana. It's been probably 18 years since I've been there, and went with my wife before we were married, and that's one place that we say for sure that we'll go back to. And we went on our honeymoon to Paris. We'd love to go back to Paris, but before we go back to Paris, we'll go back to Greece.
Okay. Yeah, I've never been, but it's certainly on the list, so that's exciting. Good to hear.
Yep, and it's relatively inexpensive.
Yes, it is right now.
Yep.
So the last question is if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
Yeah. So this is a good question. I did kind of know this was coming, so I thought about it a little, and maybe my answer will be disappointing for having thought about it in advance. But for me, what scares me most at the moment is the threat of nuclear war. It has never gone away. I grew up through the Cold War. I was in my teens in the 80s, and the 90s came, and the Soviet Union had broken up, and people didn't seem so concerned about it anymore. But it always stayed in the back of my mind that you have nuclear weapons. Those haven't gone away, even if the immediate threat seems to have lessened, and all the more so today. That really scares me. And so I suppose if I got that magic wand, I would wipe away nuclear technology, although it has lots of good applications and purposes as well. If I could wipe that away, I'd feel a lot safer.
Yeah, I think we all would. So on that note, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So I just wanted to say, Bill, thanks again for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me, John.
It's great having you on. And for everyone listening, the book is Free Dakota, Bill Irwin. It is a great book. There's lots to learn and a great story as well. So thanks a bunch, Bill.
Thanks so much, John.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.